Hello, my name is Phil Easter, historian and writer from Baltimore, Maryland, also known as the Amazing Memory Man. We are recording on Sunday, November 5th, 2023. This is story number 41 on my YouTube channel, which is Phil Easter, the Amazing Memory Man. It was exactly 60 years ago this month, November 1963, the first major national tragedy that I actually remember in my lifetime, the assassination of President John Fitzgerald Kennedy. I remember well that Friday afternoon of November 22nd, 1963. I was 11 years old, in the 6th grade, at the Cathedral of Mary Our Queen grade school in North Baltimore. It was about 1:30 in the afternoon, and the principal of our school apparently had been listening to the radio. She came into our classroom and addressed the teacher by name, but we could all hear. The most shocking sentence I've ever heard in my life resonates with me even 6 decades later. Mrs. O'Keefe, the president has been shot. Oh, to hear that, it was just incredible to hear that. One of the youngest presidents in American history, John F. Kennedy, was just 46 years old. He was 43 when he was elected a few years earlier in 1960. The second youngest president ever. Teddy Roosevelt was president at age 42 when his vice president, William McKinley, was assassinated back in 1901. And Kennedy was 43 at the time of his inauguration. Second youngest president ever. He was so important in a major event, the space program, which was gaining greater interest in the early 1960s. Actually started under President Eisenhower, but Kennedy is the president who really accelerated the space program. And he and his wife, Jackie, really were such a good-looking couple. They called that era, some people called it Camelot. And the musical Camelot just came out a few years before. President Kennedy went to Dallas that day, arriving at Love Field a little after noon on November 22nd, 1963. There was a motorcade arranged for him to go through the streets of Dallas. It had been raining earlier that morning, but the rain had stopped about the time the Kennedys arrived in Dallas. And the Secret Service, one of the men asked Mr. President, do you want the bubble top closed or open? And President Kennedy said he wanted it open so he could easily wave to the people, wave to the crowd. Better to have kept raining that day because the bubble top would have been closed. And most likely, even if the assassin had fired the shots, they probably would not have penetrated the bubble top car. But it was open, and Kennedy and his wife were enjoying seeing the people of Texas, and Vice President Johnson was also there in another car. Kennedy and his wife rode in a car along with Governor Conley and his wife, the governor of Texas. And Governor Conley and his wife were sitting in the car in front of the Kennedys. You had the driver, of course, but behind him you had Governor Conley and his wife, and then behind them was President Kennedy and his wife, Jackie. And at some point they passed close to a warehouse that I think was called the Texas Book Depository. It had a lot of books for high school students around the state of Texas. And from the 6th floor window is where Lee Harvey Oswald fired 3 shots. And the motorcade rushed to Parkland Memorial Hospital, but within half an hour, Kennedy was pronounced dead. An incredible shock for the nation. And I've seen videos of the CBS television network that afternoon was showing a soap opera called As the World Turns, and of course that was interrupted with a bulletin, and a little while later, the great CBS television newsman Walter Cronkite came on the air, visibly upset, and reported to the nation that the president had been shot, and that a little while later he reported that he had died. Well, Air Force One was going to head back to Washington, D.C. pretty quick after that terrible event. They had Kennedy's body was in a casket, and Vice President Lyndon Johnson took the oath of office as the 36th President of the United States on Air Force One. His wife was on one side of him, and Jackie Kennedy, the martyred First Lady of the martyred President, was on the other side. As you can see in one of the photographs I have put up here today. In Washington, D.C., over the next couple of days, President Kennedy's casket was at the rotunda of the Capitol. And 2 days after the assassination, on Sunday, November 24th, 1963, my mom took me to Washington. We were among 250,000 people who stood for hours in line to walk just for a few minutes once you got inside to pay our respects to President Kennedy. There was an honor guard of 5 military men from each of the major services, Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard, at all times. And it was a very touching experience that I remember to this day. Now, while we were waiting in line at some point, I think someone near us had a transistor radio, and they told us that Oswald had been shot. Apparently he was shot by a man named Jack Ruby, who was the Dallas nightclub owner. And it's been great speculation over the years, why did Ruby do this? Some people initially thought that he was just so sad about President Kennedy being assassinated. He wanted to kill Oswald, the alleged killer. But really, Oswald never stood trial, and we'll never know the full details of everything. There have been various theories throughout the years. There was a Warren Commission established a short time thereafter. They concluded that Oswald was the lone shooter, but many people wonder if there was not a second shooter and if more people were involved in the conspiracy, including possibly Jack Ruby. The president's funeral was on Monday, November 25th, 1963. And we watched that on television. My family and I watched that on television back in Baltimore. And a number of dignitaries from around the world attended Kennedy's funeral. Each generation of Americans has, sadly, some national tragedy to remember. Years later, many people who were young on January 28, 1986, will probably remember the Space Shuttle Challenger when it blew up 59 seconds after it took off from Cape Canaveral. And people even younger, of course, remember September 11th, 2001 as a national tragedy, the first one they remember when our country was attacked by terrorists. But for many of us about my age, the assassination of President John F. Kennedy is still very vivid in our memory, even 60 years later. The death of one man, but one great man, an American president. He became the 4th president to be assassinated. Abraham Lincoln was the first in 1865, Garfield the second in 1881, and 20 years later, William McKinley in 1901. President John F. Kennedy was the first president I remember pretty well. I do have vague memories of Dwight Eisenhower as president when I was very young, but when Kennedy was elected in November 1960, I had just turned 8 years old. When he was inaugurated on January 20, 1961, my mom went to his inauguration that day, and I watched it on TV. And so again, I was 11 years old on that tragic day of November 22nd, 1963. 60 years ago this month, John Fitzgerald Kennedy, born May 29, 1917, graduated from Harvard University in 1940, and served in the United States Navy in World War II. He was a lieutenant junior grade on a PT boat called PT 109, a crew of 12 men that was sliced in half by a Japanese destroyer at nighttime. And Kennedy's courage was amazing, how he helped one of his men. They had to swim several miles. I think he did like a side stroke, or pulling one of his men to safety when they reached the island. And 8 of the 12 men did survive. Sadly, 4 died, but 8 of the 12 survived. And Kennedy, over the next few weeks, was able to reach someone on another island, and the men were rescued. He's a true war hero. And then 1 year after the war ended, in 1946, he ran for Congress, was elected to Congress, House of Representatives. In 1952, he was elected to the Senate. And he and Jackie were married on September 12, 1953. In 1960, as I said before, John Kennedy was elected the 35th president. His presidency lasted for exactly 1,036 days, less than 3 years. We remember John Fitzgerald Kennedy, the 35th president of the United States, sadly taken from us when he was only 46 years old on November 22nd, 1963. This is Phil Easter, the amazing memory man. We'll see you next time for another story on another subject. As the great CBS television newsman Edward R. Murrow said back in the 1950s when he finished his broadcast each night, good night and good luck.